Assalamualaikum. Welcome to Nasr Public School online teaching system. Unit 1 Structure of Living Organisms. Part 2 Reproductive part of plant. This lecture is for class 7 subject science week 2 lesson 2. Students learning outcomes. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to define the reproductive part of a plant, explain the parts of a typical flower, describe the characteristics of the reproductive part of a plant, and state the function of the reproductive part of a plant. Now students, do you know the largest and the smallest flower found on earth? Yes. The largest flower found on earth weighs 15 pounds and can grow up to the 3 feet. It is called the Rafflesia arnoldi. And the smallest is the Wolfia, and it's the size of a grain of rice. Flowers are more than pretty things. They are responsible for the reproduction of plants and are absolutely essential. Let's learn more about them. Now let's move to the definition of the reproductive part of plant. Plants are majorly classified on basis of presence or absence of flower into flowering plant and non-flowering plant. A flower is a characteristic feature of flowering plants and is actually an extension of the shoot meant for reproduction. Flowers are attractive and appear in different colors and shapes to attract pollinators who help in pollen transfer. So, the flower is the reproductive part of a plant that makes fruits and seeds from which new plants of the same kind are produced. In some plants, the flowers are arranged in a group or cluster called an inflorescence. Parts of a flower. Number 1 is a pedicel. A pedicel is a short flower stalk in an inflorescence or cluster of flowers. Number 2 is a receptacle. It is that part of the flower to which the stalk is attached to. It is small and found at the center of the base of the flower. Third one is the calyx. The calyx is the outermost roll and is composed with sepals. And the fourth one is sepals. These are the small green leaf-like parts which protect the buds. The main function of the calyx and its sepals is to protect the flower before it blossoms, means in the bud stage. Now students, next is the corolla. The corolla is the colored part of the flower and is the second roll from the outside. Next is the petals. These are brightly colored scented leaves lies just above the sepal layer. Now look at the picture. This is the structure of a typical flower. So we can see from the base, this is called the pedicel. With the pedicel we have the receptacle as we discussed. With the receptacle we have the green leafy like structure called the sepals. With the sepals we have the brightly colored area called the petals, and in the center we can see the female reproductive part of a flower that is also called the gynoecium, and the upper part is called the stigma, the middle part is called the style, and the lower part is called the ovary, and within the ovary the flower have the ovules. And the next part, this one, is called the male reproductive part of flower, that is also called the androecium. In this part we can see the thin-like structure, thread-like structure that is called the stamen, and the stamen has two parts. The upper part is called the anther and this layer is called the flamen. And this is the structure of a typical flower. The next part is androecium. The androecium is the male part of the flower which forms the third row. Stamen, they are structurally divided into two parts. Number one is the filament. The filament is a part that is long and a thin stalk. Next one is the anther. The anther is attached to the filament and contains 4 pollen sacs. Now look at the picture, that is the structure of a stamen. As we have discussed, that filament is a part that is long and thin stalk, and the anther is attached to the filament and contains 4 pollen sacs. That is clearly in the picture, it has a 4 pollen sacs. As we know, the androecium is the male reproductive part of a plant, just like the gynoecium is a female part of the flower and is composed of carpels. It consists of 4 parts. Number 1, style. It is a long, slender and thin stalk that holds the stigma. Now look at the picture. This is the style that holds the stigma. Once the pollen reaches the stigma, the style starts to become hollow and forms a tube called the pollen tube, which takes the pollen to the ovaries to enable fertilization. The next one is the stigma. It is the flat tip of the carpel. The stigma contains a sticky substance whose job is to catch pollen grains from different pollinators or those dispersed through the wind. They are responsible to begin the process of fertilization. Number 3 is the ovary. Ovary is the soil basal part containing the female sex cells called the ovules. And the last, 4th one is the ovules. These are the egg cells of a flower. They are contained in the ovary. As you can see in the picture and clearly here, these are the ovules. So, the ovules, in the event of a favorable pollination where a compatible pollen reaches the stigma and eventually reaches the ovary to fuse with the ovules, this fertilized product forms the fruit and the ovules become the seeds of a fruit.
Let us study the structure of a flower in detail.
Let's have a look on the video. I hope you will enjoy it.
The flower is made up of 2 non-essential whorls and 2 essential whorls. The stalk of the flower is called pedicel, which has a swollen structure known as the thalamus. Calyx is the outermost whorl of the flower. It consists of sepals, which are usually green in color. It is the outermost non-essential whorl of the flower. Its main function is to protect the flower in its bud stage. As the sepals are green, they also carry out photosynthesis. Corolla is the second non-essential whorl. It is composed of petals that are large and showy. Petals are usually brightly colored and attract insects for pollination. The next inner whorl is the androecium that comprises a number of stamens. Each stamen consists of a filament and an anther. The anther of this flower has 2 anther lobes joined with the help of a connective. Each of these contains numerous pollen grains. When the anther matures, these pollen grains are released. A magnified view of a pollen grain shows a hard outer covering called exine. The inner thin layer is called intine. We find a generative cell and a tube cell within a pollen grain. The 4th floral whorl is the gynoecium, which is the female reproductive part of a flower. It has a terminal knob-like portion known as stigma. The stigma continues as a thin stalk-like structure called style. which ends into a swollen, pear-shaped body known as ovary. A section of the ovary shows chambers known as locules. These locules have ovules inside them. Each ovule is attached to the placenta by a stalk-like structure called the funiculus. To summarize, a typical flower has 4 floral whorls. Calyx is the outermost whorl. It is made up of units called sepals. The next inner whorl is the corolla, which is composed of bright petals. Inner to the petals is the male reproductive whorl called the androecium. Its units are called stamens. They produce pollen grains within their anther lobes. The innermost whorl is the gynoecium, which is the female reproductive whorl. These 4 whorls together form a complete flower.
Now let's have a look on the summary of the lesson. The flower is a reproductive part of a plant that makes fruits and seeds from which new plants of the same kind are produced. Parts of a flower. Pedicel is the stalk of the flower. Receptacle is that part of the flower to which the stalk is attached to. Calyx is the outermost roll and is composed with sepals. Sepals are the small green leaf-like parts which protects the buds. Flora is the colored part of the flower and is the second roll from the outside. Petals are brightly colored, scented leaves lies just above the sepal layer. Androecium is the male reproductive part of a flower. It has the 2 parts, the filament and the anther. The filament is a part that is long and a thin stalk. The anther is attached to the filament and contains 4 pollen sacs. The next one is the gynoecium. Gynoecium is the female reproductive part of a flower that has the parts style, stigma, ovary and ovules. Style is a long, slender and thin stalk that holds the stigma. Stigma is the flat tip of the carpel. Ovary is the swollen basal part that contains the female sex cells called the ovules, and ovules are the egg cells of a flower. They are contained in the ovary. I hope students you have enjoyed the lesson. Thank you so much, and Unit 1 will be continued in next video lecture part 3.